Is it possible? Have we entered into the time frame for the rapture? What is the truth about the rapture? Is it actually in the Bible? And if so, then what does the Bible say about it? And is this different than what we've been taught according to the traditions of men? Also, does the Bible give us a time frame for it? Can we know God's timing for the rapture? Welcome to the Spirit of Prophecy. I'm your host, Luther Mark, and in this lesson we will begin our study of the rapture in Matthew 24.
And I refer to it as the outline for the end times. I believe that the Bible is true and that Scripture should support Scripture. Here a little, there a little. And so the reason I refer to Matthew 24 as an outline for the end times, because I think and believe and teach that it also lines up in the things we see in Matthew 24. That's the things we see in the book of Revelation. And the order that they appear in Matthew 24 is also quite possibly the order of what we see things that will happen in the book of Revelation. Now, there is a way to read the book of Revelation where everything makes sense and everything falls into place. And I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But for now, let's look at Matthew 24. And I want to highlight some things there because here's the true thing that I think we can understand. We can always watch Israel. And when we see prophetic things happening in Israel, we can know that it's biblical and we can truly answer the question, are we in the last days? But in Matthew 24, it's talking about the sign of the times and what it will be like at the end of the age. And in verse 6 it says, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See, you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." So when will the end start? When will it begin according to Matthew 24? In the very next verse, in verse 7, it says, "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." Now right there, I like to point out that that very well could be the world wars, World War I, World War II, because before that, you may have had a king or a nation that would rise up against another nation or a king or a dictator that would try to occupy another area next to him and take it over. But what we see in the Bible, nation versus nation, it actually can be translated to mean ethnos versus ethnos. And it's something that's on a grand scale. Surely we saw that with World War I, as there were over 16 countries, there was many countries involved. Over 50 million soldiers fought in World War I. Over 16 million people died. And it truly was evil against good. It were people that were wanted to dominate and control the entire earth. And so there were prophetic things that we saw toward the end of World War I. For example, we can read the next verse where it says, "And there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places." And there was a huge earthquake at the beginning of or a few years right there before World War I. But at the end of World War I, excuse me, I'm getting tongue-tied here. But at the end of World War I, there was a huge pestilence or plague that came about. It's called the Spanish flu. It infected over 500 million people. 50 million people died. So we can pay attention to that because that's what's predicted. But there was something else prophetic that happened at the end of World War I that I want to mention that had to do with Israel. And what that was, it was called the Balfour Declaration. And so for the first time in something like over 1,800 years, it was the first time that the Jewish people were allowed back to their homeland, which was then called Palestine. And so until 1948, you had Jews who were coming back to Palestine, but then something happened in 1948 at the end of World War II that was very prophetic, and it fulfilled prophecy. So again, at the end of World War I, we had the prophecy of Ezekiel 37 where it talks about the bones stand up and flesh growing on them. And that's a prophecy and has always been thought to be a prophecy for the return of Israel as a country. But again, at the end of World War II, we saw that according to Isaiah 66, that a nation would be formed in one day. And so the fulfillment of that prophecy happened in May of 1948 when Israel became a country in one day. And so again, we can truly understand that that's a sign and that's a symbol or a red flag, or if you want to call it that, for the end times or the last days because it fulfilled Bible prophecy when Israel became a country. And we can certainly assume that very possibly we're in the last days. Now, at this point, I want to stop and point something out. The Bible is full of prophecies and parallels and patterns. And it's been said that you can know the end from the beginning. But what I'm about to suggest to you is it possible to also know the beginning from the end? Now, in Ecclesiastes, we can read in 3:1, it says, to everything there is a season. There's a time for every purpose under heaven. So in Matthew 24, is there a specific time frame there that we can pay attention? So what I want to do right now is jump over to Matthew 24, verses 36 through 39. And let's understand a specific time frame that is mentioned for the possible labor pains, because that's what Matthew 24 represents, is the labor pains. And it says in verse 36, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until that day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be." So what I'm suggesting here is that there's a parallel in the story of Noah. So as it was tribulations in those days with the great flood, so also it will be tribulations in the last days. And it will happen with the coming of the Son of Man. So let's take a quick look at Genesis and see what it was like in the days of Noah. And so in the days of Noah, in chapter 6 in Genesis, in verse 3, God is looking at mankind, and he's decided he's going to judge mankind. And it says, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years." So what I'm suggesting or proposing is it possible that the labor pains in the last days, which we very well could be in right now, are they 120 years? So what happened back then is God decided he was going to judge mankind. He said, man's days shall be 120 years. And then sometime after that, he found and he you might say discovered Noah. Because in verse 8 it says, "But Noah." And so he's going to judge mankind, but he said, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so after that, we can read about the genealogy of Noah and how he had triplets. He had 3 boys, and it says, "And Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth." And then for about the next 100 years, the boys grew up and they helped Noah build the ark. And then when the ark was finished, then the floods came. So that's the things that we can take from the days of Noah, and we can understand that quite possibly the last days, the labor pains that we see mentioned in Matthew 24, could they be 120 years? Let's jump back into Matthew 24 over here where I left off. And it says, "And there will be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places." Certainly in other videos I've pointed out that in the last 100 years, earthquakes have grown in numbers and frequency and in strength. And so back then, 100 years ago, we were having about 40 major earthquakes per year that were 5.0 or greater. However, they've grown with intensity and frequency every year since then, about 100 years ago, to now we're having easily over 1,500 earthquakes that are 5.0 or greater. So literally, it appears that the earth is in labor pains. Because that's what it says next. It says, "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and then there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." The beginning of sorrows, another way to say that, is labor pains. And then it says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." And then it goes and talks about many other things there. But in verse 14 it comes up and it says, "And the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." And so for many years when I was teaching the Bible, I would tell people, this is where we are, because since 2018, it's officially been reported by many Christian organizations that the gospel, for the first time in almost 2,000 years, the gospel is being preached to all the nations now. Since 2018, not to every person, but to all the nations, just like Scripture says. And so what I've suggested since 2018 is that this is where we are in the labor pains. We're in this gap of time between verse 14 and 15. So what happens in this gap of time? And we're going to see persecution increase as we go along here. Because again, in verse 14, it says, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So you have this gap of time where there's persecution according to the books of Mark and Luke. And then in verse 15, what happens? It says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So what that is the abomination of desolation. That's where the devil comes in the flesh as the Antichrist, and he stands in the temple and declares himself God of this world. That's what the abomination of desolation is. Now, some people say that we're far away from this, that they have to build a temple in Jerusalem again, and that that's not going to happen anytime soon, so we're nowhere near the end times. Well, there's another possibility. You see, we, the USA, we were founded on the Bible and on godly principles. And so in a way, we're God's people too. And so what we have to understand, and what most people may not think about or remember, is we have a temple in this country that was dedicated to the God of the Bible. And it's called the Capitol Building. Now, I'm not saying the Antichrist is going to stand in the Capitol Building of the United States and declare himself God. What I'm saying is he might, because it is referred to and was originally called the Temple of the People. Again, referring back to Nebuchadnezzar being king of ancient Babylon, and the parallel prophecy there is he became a beast for 7 years. So if we are Mystery Babylon, and if the things I'm saying are correct according to an interpretation of the Bible, then that's something for us to surely watch out for. Because when we see that, wherever it is, whether it's in the temple of the Capitol building or whether it's at some temple in Jerusalem, when we see the abomination of desolation, when there's a person standing there who will be the devil in the flesh and he will declare himself God of this world, then in verse 21 it says, for then there will be great tribulation, such has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. In other words, the abomination of desolation, and then we enter to a time of great tribulation. And it goes on and tells what that is like during that period of time. But what I want to point out to you, because remember I said I was going to talk about the rapture and God's timing concerning the rapture from a biblical point of view. And so in verse 29, chapter 24, verse 29, it talks about the coming of the Son of Man. And it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And then in 31 it says, and he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And so very simply, what I'm suggesting to you is that the sign of the Son of Man that we read about here toward the end of Matthew 24, that the sign of the Son of Man is the rapture. Because at what other time will he send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect? Now, if we look in the book of Mark, in chapter 13, we're going to find something very similar. And in Mark 13, it also talks about the labor pains, very similar to what Matthew 24 talks about. And we can read there a very similar verse. But it says in Mark 13, chapter 13, verse 24, it says, but in those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will fall, and the powers in heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power. And in verse 27 it says, and then he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest parts of earth to the farthest parts of heaven. And again, that clearly describes what I believe is the rapture. Now, if we go back to Matthew 24, there's something I want to point out to people. Because again, I call Matthew 24 the outline for the end times. And so if we look there toward the part talking about the coming of the Son of Man, which is verses 29 through 31, did you notice that they come after verse 15, which was the abomination of desolation? So therefore, what I'm suggesting is that the abomination of desolation comes first, and that the rapture comes after the abomination of desolation. That would indicate or suggest that there is no pre-trib rapture. So again, these things happen after the abomination of desolation, as well as in the book of Mark. So in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, you've got the abomination of desolation, and then after that, you've got the sign of the coming of the Son of Man, which appears to happen during what's called the Great Tribulation. Just to give you a heads up on my book, it is being published by Trilogy Publishing. They're a division of TBN, or Trinity Broadcasting Network. It has 22 chapters, over 600 pages, and it includes over 800 individual Bible verses to support the things I'm teaching, just like what you've heard today, of what the Bible actually says versus possibly things we've been taught.
Want to know more about the rapture? Be sure to check out Time for the Rapture Part 2. Part 2 helps you to gain new understandings and keen prophetic insight. Part 2 is even better and goes into much deeper details about the mystery of the rapture. Be sure to check out my YouTube channel, thespiritofprophecy.com. I'd like to thank you for watching, and may the Lord bless you and keep you.